As many of you probably already know, Flames of Destruction dropped this past Friday, and it's really exciting because we get 100 new cards, and there's a whole bunch of cards in there that are probably going to make an impact on the metagame. But in today's video, which is sponsored by TCGplayer.com, I want to talk about the 5 best budget options from this set, because obviously there's going to be really powerful secret rares in the set. I think everyone kind of knows that, but I want to talk about 5 cards you can pick up for pretty much dirt cheap and that you can play in a variety of decks. And that's worth mentioning because there are cards in this set that are not able to be played in a whole bunch of different decks, and while those cards might be budget as well, I want to talk about cards that are a little bit more generic. So first on this list we have FA Dawn Dragster. Now you might be thinking, Doug, isn't this card only for FAs? And you would be wrong, because this card's actually a generic level 7 synchro with a really powerful negation effect. So it comes out on the field at 2100 attack, which isn't a crazy amount for a level 7 synchro monster, but this thing actually lets you negate spells and traps or their effects, which is pretty darn good in a metagame that's so heavily decided by very powerful spells and traps such as Regeki or Pot of Desires or Twin Twisters, all the sorts of cards that you don't want your opponent to have resolve. You can summon Dawn Dragster and just negate them, which is pretty easy to do in a lot of decks that are playing cards like Destrudo, or even when you just summon like a hand trap like Ghost Dugger or Ash Blossom and then synchro into this card using a level 4 monster. It also has Piercing. That's probably never going to come up, but it's worth mentioning that you can sometimes just chip away at your opponent. I think that comes up most often when your opponent has resolved a Scapegoat and you happen to have this card in the field and maybe they didn't read it fully. They might have missed the part where it has Piercing. You can simply just hit them for 2100. Pretty good. The number 4 spot goes to Monster Reborn. This card's hilarious. I think a lot of people really like the artwork and really like the lore behind it. And anyway, though, this was the sneak peek promo, and even though the sneak peek promo is a couple dollars more than the actual print, this card does come in the regular set as a common, so it's less than 10 cents. And this card's kind of neat. So you target 3 monsters in your graveyard, your opponent chooses 1, you special summon it, and if you do, banish the rest. So you can only activate 1 of this card per turn. This card's really neat because it kind of reminds me of cards like Pantheism of the Monarchs, where a lot of times you can just pick 3 of the same card. Sometimes, though, you can sort of mind game your opponent. In this case, your opponent doesn't necessarily know which card you want to bring back, which means that sometimes there's not even really a right answer that's super obvious for them. And if you can really set this card up, you can put it in a position where no matter which card you bring back, it's really good. And I think that the most obvious scenario for that is if you're bringing back something that you're immediately going to use for a Link Summon or a Synchro Summon or Exceed Summon. Those types of cards, it doesn't really matter what you bring back as long as they meet the requirements for whatever you're trying to bring out. And this card's really strong. I think that it's a pretty big sleeper pick from the set just in general, but also as a budget card. You can play this in a variety of decks, only because if your deck doesn't necessarily have a generic revival card other than Monster Reborn and Soul Charge, but you want a little bit extra sort of late game control cards, this card is definitely the one for you. At number 3, we are continuing the revival spell theme with World Legacy Succession. Now, don't let the name fool you. This card does not have to be played in a World Legacy or World Chalice deck. It pretty much goes in any deck that plays a lot of Link monsters. So what does this card do? Well, you can target 1 monster in your graveyard, special summon it to a zone a Link monster points to, and then it's just a hard once per turn effect. You notice here, it doesn't have any restrictions on what you bring back. The only restriction on this card is that it has to be reviving something that Link monster can point to, but that's really easy. And I think in a lot of cases the way that you want to use this is by Link summoning 1 monster using 2 monsters and then immediately activating World Legacy Succession to bring back 1 of the monsters that you use for the Link summon. I think there's a lot of cases where that's really good. One of the more obvious ones is using 2 cards to summon Underclock Taker and then using World Legacy Succession to bring it back, and I think that's a really cool application. But pretty much any deck playing a lot of Link monsters can actually bring this out pretty easily. So I'm thinking of any deck playing Scapegoat, you can potentially summon your big Borreload monster, and then you can use World Legacy Succession to bring back 1 of the Links that you summon off of using the Scapegoats. That's pretty powerful, especially for bringing back something like Missus Radiant that then can buff its own attack and sort of floats when it dies. This card is just really versatile, and I think that as more decks play Link monsters and they play more Link monsters and they keep summoning those Link monsters, this card just becomes better. And I think that there's pretty much every deck out there is going to be playing some Link monsters, but the ones that you want to play World Legacy Succession in are the ones that are able to summon Link monsters pretty much every first turn. I think another prime example of a deck that can play this card is anything that's playing the Nightmare cards. should be playing World Legacy Succession. This card is just way too good in the decks that are using Nightmares. The Nightmares have really advantageous link arrows for this card, so if you're playing Nightmares, if you're splashing the Nightmare engine or the Nightmare link monsters in your extra deck, definitely consider playing World Legacy Succession. At number 2, we have Called by the Grave. Now, you might have already seen this card, and that's because it was actually released as a super rare promo card in the Extreme Force Special Edition, which was released about a month ago. So you might have already played this card, you might have already played against this card, but if you haven't picked up your copies, now is the perfect time, because in Flames of Destruction, this card is actually a common, which means it's basically free to pick up. It's only like 50 cents, which is incredible because this card has seen widespread competitive use. What does it do? Well, it's a quick play spell card that lets you target one monster in your opponent's graveyard, you banish it, and if you banish it until the end of the next turn, its effects are negated, as well as the activated effects and effects on the field of monsters with the same original name. So what does that mean? Well, that means if your opponent Ash Blossoms you or Ghost Ogres you, you can simply chain Called by the Grave. Even if it's your first turn, because it's a quick play spell, you can then banish the copy that they discarded, and then that copy is negated, as well as any other copies. But more importantly, it negates the card that they discarded, which means that your cards are going to resolve a lot more consistently. And that's a big deal for a deck that really needs your cards to resolve. I think of decks like Blue Eyes that have a lot of spell cards with hefty costs, and if your opponent manages to hit Ash Blossom on one of those cards, you're in a really rough spot. So Called by the Grave is an excellent addition to any deck that has a lot of hefty costed spells, such as Trade-In or Pot of Desires or Melody of the Awakening Dragon, or even Brilliant Fusion, cards that you really don't want negated. Now, this card has seen a lot of competitive success, and that makes it a really good pickup for pretty much any deck, because hand traps are good against almost any strategy out there, maybe besides True Draco or any deck playing a mono Awado, but other than that deck or decks playing that very specific spirit monster, hand traps are sort of the best counter to the entire metagame, which makes a card like Called by the Grave so good. Also, this doesn't come up too often, but this card technically can negate the second and third copy of a card that your opponent is summoning. For example, if your opponent went first and did their dinosaur combos with Soul Eating Oviraptor, a couple turns down the line, if they summon a second copy of the Oviraptor, you can then chain Called by the Grave to banish the first one, and that negates the one that they just summoned. It doesn't come up as often as the hand trap application, but it comes up enough that I want to mention it. Now, this card is a pretty safe buy simply because it's being played in pretty much any deck that loses to hand traps, which, as I already described, is pretty much every deck out there. The number one spot on this list of the top 5 budget cards in Flames of Destruction is a card that I think a lot of people, including myself, thought was going to be printed as a secret rare, and that is Red Reboot. So this card actually got printed as a super rare, and oh man, is this card good. It's really good against decks that play traps, and let's just take a look at it. So when your opponent activates a trap card, negate the activation, and if you do, set that card face down, then your opponent can set one trap card directly from their deck. For the rest of this turn, after this card resolves, your opponent cannot activate trap cards. You can activate this card from your hand by paying half your life points. So this thing's kind of all over the place, and it might be hard to see why this card is so darn good at the first time you read it, because this card does, in fact, it doesn't destroy the card you're negating, and it actually gives your opponent an extra card, and also you have to pay half your life points if you want to use it from your hand. But despite all of those things, this card ends up being a extremely powerful card in Flames of Destruction, and we're very likely to see this at the top tables. The reason being is that this is one of the best counters to a set 5 pass opening. If your opponent is playing True Dracos and they card a Demise and they end with 5 trap cards, you can simply activate Red Reboot on the first trap card that they use, and then you can negate all the other trap cards that they would have used, and also the one that they just used, and that completely shuts them out of the game outside of their monster effects and their spell effects. Red Reboot is so crazy against back row decks. I think of decks like Paleozoics, a deck I'm extremely fond of. This deck completely rips it apart. I know that it gives your opponent one free trap card, and it might seem like a lot that you're doing that as well as paying half your life points, but this is an all-tempo based card. You're using this to blank your opponent's back row and just defeat them on that turn, or set up a crazy board that they can't deal with, because as it turns out, trap cards in general tend to be pretty slow. A lot of times giving your opponent a free trap card with Red Reboot doesn't really matter if you're establishing a crazy first turn board, or your first turn board if you're going second, I should say. And man, this card is so darn powerful, and there could be comparisons drawn with this card and Dark Bribe, but the main difference between this card and Dark Bribe is simply that last line of text. The fact that you can activate this card from your hand is just insane, because it means that you can use it on your very first turn when you're going second against a huge back row. And I think this card is a super safe buy, just because it's very unlikely that I'll get hit on a Forbidden and Limited list anytime soon. But I think for the upcoming months, this is one of the best outs to those heavy back row decks like True Draco, like Frog Paleozoics. Anyway though, that is going to be the top 5 budget Yu-Gi-Oh cards in Flames of Destruction. I put all the prices on these cards throughout the video. They come from TCGplayer.com. If you want to go buy these cards, wink wink, there is a link to TCG Player in the description of this video. And thank you so much for sponsoring this video. I will see you guys later. Goodbye.